While we're waiting for that, I'll go ahead and if you would sit down as you're able, go ahead and bring up something that Aaron and I have been wanting to discuss before the class starts, and that is we have had a great time doing this together. I've learned a lot. I know he's learned a lot about one another and just being together, learning from Christian Jewish perspectives. And the class is scheduled for 2 more Sundays, but we both want to keep teaching in January, mid-January. Thank good. And the question then to ask is, what would you like us to teach? Now, there are a few, I wrote about this in the upcoming newsletter. There are a few options. We skipped a quarter or so of the parables because they were so long. We could make up those and do other ones. We can add in addition, some type of topics or write in, ask the priest and rabbi type question. For example, it was brought up a week or 2 ago. Wait, what is heaven when we talk about that? What is hell? How does one get there? That could be a standalone thing. Probably not every single week doing that. We could focus with adding those type of epic Jewish stories, what we would call the Old Testament, particularly from Genesis, from a Christian and Jewish perspective. By the way, I will give Aaron all the credit in the world because we're more playing on my home field all the time, the parables. He's not read all these before, correct?
True.
So what's the expression used about trying to learn all? I give him a big packet of material every week, and he goes home and reads it, like drinking from a fire hose. So we could talk about some of the epic stories from Genesis, which would put him on more home turf, but all of us can learn together. So email me, write it down, tell me or Aaron or both of us. We would love it if you would do this or that. And as I say, we can always do the ask a priest and a rabbi. We kind of put those in various points when they make sense. Does that sound good to everybody? So probably mid-January. Catherine might remember, there's going to be an environmental stewardship discussion. Oh, Wendy's right here. What date is that? January 8th will be about...
We're going to do a theological reflection on Calvary's approach to climate care and other environmental topics.
January 8th, and then the week after, Sunday, January 15th, is when we would resume some version of this class. Do we have December 4th reading yet? I feel like I hear my guy, the producer, keep going, filling time, we're not ready yet.
Stretch.
Don't land this thing yet, we got to keep it going. What ideas do you have for next class? Catherine.
How about a comparison of the one God, the Jewish people, and the Trinity?
How about a class on the one God and the Trinity? Great question. I was hoping start with a softball or what's your favorite team?
Wendy just announced maybe creation care in the two.
Building on what Wendy just announced, creation care within the two traditions, how from Jewish perspective, Christian perspective, and by the way, I don't speak for all Christians. He doesn't speak for all Jews. We both come from a particular rooted tradition within that, but we can speak specifically and generally. What is our approach to environmentalism or climate justice or various ways to say that? Yes?
January 15th will be Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday weekend.
Okay.
And next year's going to be the 60th anniversary of his I Have a Dream speech.
Okay.
Wow, that's right.
Very good.
And that's a softball, right?
That is. Thank you. What, Russ?
So we've had an ongoing debate in our corner of Christianity about marriage and who can get married and who can't.
Who can get married in our corner of Christianity?
And And that whole debate has been without the slightest reference that I know of to the Song of Songs, which I think is the foundational text, or could be. And it would be interesting to hear how, in the Jewish tradition, that text is read.
How many of you, without snickering, have read the Song of Songs? There was a brief moment, I was in a Baptist youth group, and the older boys thought it would be hilarious to get us to read the Bible aloud, and we did, and they had us read part of the Song of Songs. And what is the Song of Songs? Aaron?
It's erotic love poetry.
It's erotic love poetry in the Bible. Some things just stick in your head forever. Your breasts are like twin gazelles. I remember being 12, I was like, is that a good thing? I guess. Why is that in the Bible? So Russ's point, discussing marriage, I may have one of those readings, so it would be helpful. Discussing marriage, thanks.
We'll take two.
Within our two contexts, and then also specifically including the Song of Songs.
You got one.
Thanks. Anybody else? Thoughts? As I say, email them, tell us. First parable. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon, and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowners, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." End of that parable. Before I say what I think about this parable, how does that strike you? It's unfair. It's a generous man. Anybody else? Totally fair. Totally fair. Predictable. How is it predictable? Yeah. Oh, it's... Wheezy Wells is very clever. Parables always turn us upside down, so it's predictably unpredictable. Good. Anybody else? Yeah. Think twice before you say yes. I like that one. I find that I've always been annoyed by this parable. I wish Jesus hadn't said it. I think he has a terrible point of view in some ways, and it took me a long time to get over that. Probably that's what the Pharisees, how they responded to the parable too. This is unfair. This is annoying. You can't base an ethic of just pay and so on that. This is stupid economics, Jesus, and so on and so forth. Who's telling the story? Jesus. What is this parable about? And Aaron said he's really picking up the point I keep driving home over and over, so I will continue to do it until everybody gets it. What is this parable about? The kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven. By the way, Matthew uses the term kingdom of heaven. Luke, Mark use the kingdom of God. It's the same thing. But the kingdom of heaven is, what is that? Is it heaven, where the angels go and up there in the sky in puffy clouds where God... No. But what is the kingdom of heaven? What's the kingdom of God? Heaven on earth. The Messianic age realized this is what God's will on earth as in heaven in the Lord's Prayer. That's what this looks like. By the way, the readings today in church are very much like that. When the lion shall lie down with the lamb, when the lion eats straw like the ox. It's partly a reversal, but it's a whole change in how people, things interact with one another. So it's about this kingdom of God, this kingdom of heaven. This is what God's will on earth would look like. So that's what Jesus is talking about. My usual thing, context always helps. So in the chapter just before this, Jesus said, this will be familiar, also a little annoying because all of us are rich in the context of the Bible. Truly I tell you, it's hard for someone to enter, rich to enter the kingdom of heaven, easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle. Aha, those rich people. No, we're all rich in this story. The disciples heard this, who can be saved? With God, or man, humans, this is impossible. With God, all things are possible. Peter said, trying to show how awesome he is, he's the kid that annoys you. Look, Mom, I got all A's. Joey got C's. That's Peter for you. Anyway, Peter said, we've left everything to follow you. What will be there for us, Jesus? Waiting to be. Good boy, Peter, you've done a great job. Whoever's left houses, brothers, sisters, mother, father, and so on, will receive 100 times as much. So remember that when you hear this parable. If you followed God, you will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. Immediately follows this parable. So what is this parable? How has it traditionally been interpreted? What's it about? The kingdom of God, yes, but Susie. God's sense of justice is not what we expect it to be. That's pretty darn good, Susie. Well done. That's very good. Well done. Who is, again, simplistically, who's the landowner represent probably in the story? God. Is it completely invented out of whole cloth that God would be a landowner, a garden owner? Within the Hebrew Bible, is there ever an image of God as a landowner?
Yes, often.
Yes, often.
The Garden of Eden.
What, did I get something totally wrong? Yes, often. The Garden of Eden is the first example. This motif, God is tending, cultivating, caring for the world, is a normal thing. And so, the landowner, in this case, owns a vineyard. And who are all these various workers? Us. Probably it means Jews, Christians, men, women, everybody. And the story takes place, it goes back and forth between the vineyard and the marketplace. I don't know why, but I have instead of marketplace, think of guys standing out front of Home Depot, where workers are, where when you call some help, it's an hourly worker, not a skilled worker necessarily, somebody who shows up. Within Leviticus and Deuteronomy, just little fact for the story, a daily wage-earning worker was required in the Bible to be paid by the boss, by the landowner. So they should expect to be paid at the end of the day. If you're on salary, well, you know they're good for it, but if you're there one day, that's supposed to happen. So this actually fits very well within that context. Within historic Christian tradition, how has this been interpreted? Anybody know? Could go into the realm of anti-Semitism. I don't think that's the point at all. But he's telling the Pharisees and disciples, and this is a response to who gets in to God's realm. What's the basic message there? Are the Jews excluded from the kingdom of heaven? There's a question in this story. No.
Does it have to do with the worth of a human being, that we're all worth the same, even though one toils less than the other?
Great question. Is this about human worth, human dignity, that we all are worth the same, even though one toils more than the others, smarter, more handsome, taller, whatever? Maybe. The most traditional, reasonable, fair, good interpretation is that in the story, and remember, a story can have multiple meanings, but if you take it too far, it falls apart. Are the Jewish people still part of God's kingdom? Not just still part of it, they're at the core of it. The story assumes that. Guess who they are in the story, interpreted traditionally? The workers who showed up at the very beginning. They were given a covenant by God to enter into this relationship. So from the very beginning, they've been there. What the story is trying to do is, right. But then you got these upstart people who come in the tail end and oh, wow, look, this is an all cool thing. I think, do I have to do all the, we still have to do circumcision? That's not part of it? Excellent. Can I eat cheeseburgers? Yes, I'm in. Done. I don't need all those rules. I can just go, I'll come in at the very last hour and I get paid the same. That is, I enter the kingdom of heaven just like the people who've been toiling away under scorching heat all day long, dealing with all this stuff, wandering in the desert, etc., etc. And so there's room for the most traditional Jews and Christians within that kingdom. And there's room for people who you didn't think ordinarily fit. You get the good religious people, Pharisees, Sadducees, but also sinners and tax collectors. And just let me summarize that. Think of the 2 or 3 people or types of people you like least. You got that in your head? They're included too, at the last hour. More annoying, more personal, but it also means that. So there's room for all in God's economy. Is this a story about current or modern economics? We must have equity. It's not really about that at all in the sense of how we currently think about it. How could this story be interpreted as anti-Semitic, or it has been? Those grumbling Jews. You could get that. Oh, I've been here all day long and had to do all the hard work, and they should just be happy with what they have. That's, to me, a terrible interpretation, but you could see how some might say that. So I'm not suggesting that at all. It's over and over I say, we as Christians are into that covenant. That's how this idea works. You read. Aaron has several fascinating ideas, not part of any book or tradition. They're straight from the mind. Okay.
Unencumbered by any facts or tradition, here's what I think. I want to make sure that we define a few terms that we may have taken for granted or not actually reflected upon that I think are necessary to gain a sensitive and significant understanding of the parable. The first is to reiterate that the kingdom of heaven should not be understood to be a synonym with heaven, but rather, if you will, for heaven on earth. Right? The kingdom of heaven is that which we can establish here, now, if only, but isn't to be understood, the kingdom of heaven, as something that is above us or beyond us. Right? It's something that we have a hand in bringing about and establishing. the nature of a usual daily wage, which then is used as a synonym for what is just or what is right, what have you. The usual daily wage is referenced in two different points in the parable. The first is in advance of hiring the first workers. I'll pay you the usual daily wage. On that basis, they accept the invitation to come to the vineyard and toil under that scorching hot sun. And then at the end of the parable, as wages, as it were, are being meted out, it's referred to again as the usual daily wage, which then creates a sense of, or disrupts a sense of expectation in terms of what is just, what's fair. I had an expectation that I'd receive X with the understanding that that meant that others should receive less if they're in these circumstances, right? It turns things on the head, the expectations about what is just. We take from the parable that what is just is that which the landowner has determined or has agreed to, which is the coda to the parable, right? Where the landowner says to the workers who are disgruntled, I've kept my word to you, I promise you the usual daily wage, and that's what you now hold in your hand. And what I do with the rest of my money or whatever I do beyond that is not really your concern. So we understand the kingdom of heaven is meant to be what we're doing here and now. The usual daily wage is that which the usual daily wage is equal to all, whether or not it was pledged in advance or whether or not it's at the end. We learned that in the parable, that the usual daily wage is a constant. And then what is just is based upon our perspective, right? What we expect. We'll leave that for a moment as to what is just. Jonathon walked us through the idea that often this parable is understood to be messianic or to allude to the reward that we're entitled to after the day's labor is done. Others have interpreted this as an economic narrative, or that's the import we're to take away, something about when we pay or how we pay or what it means to do a day's work or what one is entitled to. And there are other stories from the Jewish tradition that parallel this, wherein a landowner comes to oversee their workers and sees that one is working more efficiently than the others and invites him to walk with him through the fields and observe what's going on, and they sort of consult with each other, and at the end of the day, everyone's paid the same amount. And those who are toiling as opposed to strolling, right, the one who's the boss gets to watch everyone else work, everyone's entitled to the same amount. So this parable, this narrative, or this idiom was not unfamiliar to those who were at the time. So we could understand it as an economic text, but I want to suggest to you that it's a lesson about what it means to live daily life today. That is to say, it's meant to be, to my mind, or I invite us to read it, as something that has applicability for us, as opposed to learning something about the ancient Middle East and how economics were handled then, or labor and management relations, or something of the sort, but that we start with the understanding that it has to do with us. Or it's only going to be meaningful if it has to do with us. That is to say, going back to the idea that what you believe is interesting, but what your beliefs lead you to do is significant. What you think about this parable is interesting, but what you think about it is only significant if it leads us to change the way in which we go about our lives, or changes our perspective such that we live more towards the kingdom of heaven, right? I want to share with you another reading from Amy Jo Levine's book, which inspired the class, and it's about the titles. We've spoken about this before. The titles we give, or the titles we've inherited, as it were, about these parables that then influence what we think it's about, or sort of put a thumb on the scale with regard to what meaning is there. Here's what she says. Despite the fact that the parable has multiple characters, a landowner, workers, a manager, multiple settings, a vineyard, a marketplace, and multiple elements, timing, moves from vineyard to market and back, the moment of payment, the traditional title of the parable is The Laborers in the Vineyard. Titles are always deceptive. They necessarily focus on one aspect of a story and so de-emphasize or mask the importance of others. They already slant our interpretation for good or for ill. The title, The Laborers in the Vineyards, or sometimes The Workers in the Vineyard, highlights first the workers and second the location. It encourages interpreters to associate with the laborers and not the landowner. This focus, in turn, allows the easy allegory that the landowner is God, and the parable becomes a lesson in how we are to understand the divine. Once allegory enters, the real world is left behind, as well as any concern the parable and Jesus, its teller, might have for issues of economics, employment, the relationship between managers and employers. The emphasis on the vineyard is another move away from the real world of managers and marketplaces, let alone a possible source of cash and labor. It is not needed to identify the parable. The parable of the complaining day laborers would have been sufficient, as would the parable of the surprising salaries. The focus on the vineyard moves the parable into allegory, since vineyards are already in the Jewish culture a metaphor for God's property. Jesus' Jewish auditors were familiar with God as the vineyard owner and with Israel as the vineyard. Therefore, if Jesus tells a story about a vineyard and an owner, the cultural repertoire of his audience presumes the association of Israel with the vineyard and the owner with God. And once we are in God's vineyard, the parable then becomes, for most readers, a message about salvation. What happens, however, if we change the title? Whereas commentator Robert Fortnes suggested the humane capitalist sounds to us both anachronistic and uneasily applied to the parable, given that the landowner is not shown making any profit, but rather only pays out more than would be expected, at least nods to the economic aspects of the parable. The verses could equally be labeled the conscientious boss, the last hired or the first paid, how to prevent the peasants from unionizing, debating a fair wage, or even lessons for both management and employers. But I want to suggest, and this is where I'm unencumbered by anything else, facts or tradition, that we think of the name of the parable for the purpose of this conversation as our daily wage. Our daily wage. And it made me think when I came to that it echoed for me our daily bread, for which we are grateful, which now is no longer the reward, but is actually the experience we have breathing, waking up and opening our eyes to what Judaism understands to be a new creation. The rabbis of the Talmudic period described sleep as 1/60th of death, and that when you woke up, it was as if creation was revealed to you anew. And if we think about that which we receive from, if you will, the landowner, if we're the workers, irrespective of how long we labor, irrespective of how long is our life, or how challenging or easy our life is compared to any other, if we think of the wages as our daily bread, which is to say the gift or the grace that is life itself, as opposed to a recompense or a reward for the way in which we spent our time, now we're in a very different space, a space which actually does acknowledge that the landowner is God, God gives to us what is just. It doesn't comport with our notion of fairness, because we've all had at various moments thoughts, right, about ourselves or others, how unfair, how unjust, right, as we compare. But when we step out of the realm of comparison, which is where a sense of jealousy and envy comes from. I was mentioning to Jonathan that I saw a clip online recently, Charles Munger. Charles Munger is the right hand to Warren Buffett, right? And so take his opinions with a grain of salt, because when you're a billionaire, you can opine about what motivates other people to the end of day. But Munger suggested that it's not greed that motivates us, but envy. That's interesting. Now, what's the difference between jealousy and envy? Jealousy is appreciating what someone else has, or wanting that, or feeling a tug because of what else is going on. But envy includes a sense of resentment, that somehow what's unfair is that someone got more than I got, and in comparison, we're unhappy and we're unsatisfied. Even as we appreciate, at least objectively, that our lives today are better than at any time for human beings in human history. Certainly our lives as Americans in the 21st century, given what we have, better than in human history, better than your parents' lives, better than your grandparents' lives, certainly better than your great-grandparents' lives, given that we have electricity and clean water and indoor plumbing, to say nothing of the quality of the experiences that we have. And yet, statistically, this generation is no happier than was the case 100 years ago or 200 years ago when they began tracking these kinds of things. And the reason is, because we're stiff-necked and arrogant, all of us Jews, because we compare ourselves to the people around us. And we don't compare ourselves to what the experience was of our immigrant parents, or what it was to live a few generations ago when they were eking out a living as opposed to having money, discretionary dollars to set aside for retirement and the rest. And that's just our propensity. So our sense that things are unfair or unjust is part of the human drama. The idea that we might get past that and not measure life in the length of our years, but rather in the meaning and memories that we create, the kinds of things that David Brooks describes as being distinguished from resume virtues and eulogy virtues. Isn't that nice? David Brooks. Resume virtues are obviously those things that we spend our time accruing and amassing and building such that we have a reputation and such that we've accomplished this. We have a long CV or resume or detailed things or our bank book or whatever it is that allow us to say, this I've accomplished. But it turns out that what we want people to say about us or what we want most to remember about those when we eulogize them has not to do with that. Although we may admire and appreciate and respect those accomplishments, the fact is what we want is people to say the kinds of things about us that you remember most about those you remember and love, right? So if that's the kingdom of heaven we're encouraged to understand that we're challenged to create, and we understand our daily wage from the laborer being that to which we are graced. I'm a bit about over my skis when I talk about grace. It's not a word that Judaism uses idiomatically with a great deal of comfort. But if we understand that given life is itself a blessing, waking up every day, we're grateful for our health, we're not promised anything. We know these kinds of aphorisms. I want to invite us to read them into, or to derive them from the parable. That the wage is not what we get at the end. How big your house is in heaven, how close to the right hand of God you get to sit. But rather, the wage is the blessing of being able to draw air, the blessing to be able to love and to receive love, the blessing we have to be able to make our lives meaningful and purposeful. Yes?
Wouldn't you substitute the word, I would say gratitude for life, as opposed to blessing or...
Gratitude.
Yeah, gratitude.
Many have suggested that gratitude is the very first religious impulse. The ability to appreciate and be grateful for what you have, right? A lot of us wake up and don't give it a second thought. No. A lot of us amble across a room and don't give it a second thought until we've had a leg in a cast or crutch, or until we begin to age. And if you're aging correctly, you should be gaining much greater empathy for everyone around you. If you don't have greater empathy for everyone around you as you're aging, you're not doing it right, and you're not paying attention, right? Which isn't to say that it gets easier. It just says that our perspective begins to change, and that for which we're grateful or how often we express gratitude may very well grow.
Well, the morning prayers in Judaism,
Yes.
that's what it is. Grateful for waking up, for seeing the light as opposed to the dark.
You say that for the,
Beautiful. So you'll remember that there's a...
say that for the recording.
Say that for the recording. You want to say it for the recording? Speaking to the mic.
Oh.
The morning prayers.
The morning prayers in Judaism, we're grateful for waking up and seeing the light as opposed to the darkness of the night. And at my age, I'm very grateful for waking up. A lot of people
Yes.
don't.
A lot of people don't wake up. That's right. Right? Judaism instructs or advises, the rabbis do, that we say 1,000 blessings a day. What kind of things might we say? Over and above opening your eyes, this one always elicits giggles. We'll see how mature this group is. That there's a blessing, traditionally, that one is to say upon using the facilities the first thing in the morning. That when you use the toilet the first thing in the morning, you should say a blessing. And the blessing is thanking God that everything opens and closes as it's supposed to. That's a phenomenal blessing. Just have a runny nose. Never mind other parts of bodies that don't open and close when they're supposed to. Things we don't give any thought to. Valves in your heart. Never mind leakages out of the body. It's no joke. And when it doesn't work, we're an extremist. Right? So being grateful for that the first time you use the toilet, that's an amazing notion. To be grateful at every point is the challenge. But to live with a sense of gratitude. If we did that, maybe we'd be closer to the kingdom of heaven, realizing it. Yes, ma'am.
How about the other way around?
Okay.
Do you think God is grateful for us?
Oh, that's really
Some
nice.
of us.
The question was, is God grateful for us? And Jonathan suggested, some of us. What would?
What would God be without us? Who's going to worship him?
Well, that's a fascinating theological question.
What does Judaism say about that?
Whether Judaism says in shorthand, essentially, that it's not the God who requires that worship, it's we who require that worship.
Same within Christianity, by the way.
Right? We'll talk about that later. All right. We'll talk about it later. The idea is that God's not, both in Judaism and Christianity, the theology is that God's not dependent upon our worship to be God.
Right, because if we didn't know about God, who the heck would?
Yes, but worship is different. So let's just, right, in that, there's a wonderful phrase, God, I'm blanking out where it's from, but it's from the Bible, where it says, when you are my witnesses, I am God, and when you are not my witnesses, I am not God. Now, the question is whether or not God is actually dependent upon our witness, or our worship, or our gratitude, or not, right? And I remember I had a cousin who suggested he'd taken one course in college in philosophy, and suggested that if you close your eyes, reality isn't there anymore. I said, really? Why don't you close your eyes and walk across the room and see if you don't bump into some furniture? It's not that God isn't there if we don't worship, and yet, insofar as we can bring God in to wherever we are, would be the way I would begin the conversation with you. But let's talk about whether God's grateful for us, right?
By the way, when we talk about the view of the one God and the Trinity, in some sense a Jewish Christian idea of God, that should be an issue. Bring that topic up again. Because more in Christianity it merged with other Greek ideas where God is perfect and all these immutable and all-powerful and omniscient. Those are not necessarily attributes to God found in the Scriptures. That gets added later. And there's lots of things like that we just kind of take for granted, but it makes a really big difference in what God we're talking about.
And didn't God give up on us a couple of times?
Oh, according to the Bible, yeah.
So the answer I would give, whether God's grateful for us, is probably not so dissimilar, and it's not such a stretch. But are parents grateful for children? Yeah, a lot of the time. A lot of the time. Right? I mean, in the Jewish tradition, the Jewish idiom, there's a lot of personification of God discussing with the rabbis or debating about whether or not the human beings that God has created are frustrating God or God celebrating the fact that they're so impudent. That is to say that there's a wonderful story. We just looked at it in our Back to the Sources class on Wednesday afternoon. Eventually we'll bring it in here on Sunday morning, in which the rabbis are arguing with a group of rabbis are arguing against a single rabbi who's asserting that the single rabbi is asserting that God agrees with him. And he brings these divine proofs where a tree moves, uproots itself, and walls of the house of study lean in, and a stream of water flows backwards. And finally, there's the divine voice that says, don't you all understand it? The law is according to this single rabbi. And all the rest of the rabbis say, we don't take advice from heaven anymore. We're going to rule the way we want to. And at the end of the story, the question is asked of the prophet Elijah, who is supposed to be the one in Jewish tradition who's going to resolve all disputes at the end of time. What did God do in that moment when these rabbis rejected the divine proofs and the divine voice and went with their own opinion? The text describes that God laughs and says, my children have defeated me, which speaks to sort of the pride that a parent feels when their offspring accomplishes something that maybe they couldn't do. Right? They've bested the parent in a particular way. Right? So it's a complex relationship. God and us and God.
Let me say something. One of the things, particularly teaching with Aaron this last several months, has reminded me, we often think of Jesus, give me words, adjectives, Christians in here particularly, to describe Jesus? Gentle, loving, patient, friend. Is this Sunday school or is this from the Bible? Those are very Christian ideas. What the Father, what does, specifically the Gospels, that's where we get our information, what does it describe him as? He's a rabbi. And so what I want...
So he's none of those things.
That was... Yeah, here, have some more softballs, Aaron. But think of him at all those other things, that's great. But think of him first as a rabbi. And rabbi is a teacher of what?
Torah.
Torah, Bible. And a rabbi, and ours in particular, uses a sense of humor to get a point across. By the way, I do that occasionally also. To disrupt...
You may not know that.
Anxiety. Think of that as the rabbi, what's this, a week or two ago we talked about, the Bible's a love story from God. It's a divine revelation straight from heaven to teach. Yes, it's all that too. But think of it as, I love you more than anything, God, and I want to share this with you. And so the rabbis are interpreters of this love story, and they're trying to get us to understand, within our own cultural context, with all the baggage and stuff we have, here's what this means. And so is it all always factually true? Of course not. Do you have to find ways so people will pay attention, will listen? So you make up a story about a bunch of people arguing with God, and he beat us in the argument. Those are beautiful ways to do that. Think of Jesus' parables as arresting, interrupting stories to get us to think about what it means if we followed all the mitzvah, if we followed all the commandments, what would happen? What would happen if we treated other people as if they were the presence of God right in front of us? What would happen if we did this and did that? One parable after another. Each parable does not represent the whole kingdom. It's always a glimpse looking at one aspect of it. You see it from this side and this side and this side. And all these different parables over time start to build out a picture of what human relationships are like and what relationships from me to God and us as a community to God look like. That's the image, the idea that Jesus is trying to convey over and over. So think of these playful, challenging, inappropriate rabbis, and Jesus is within that group. In fact, this story even today is not made up completely. They took part of an old tale and changed it. Here's a shocker. I don't mean to upset you. You'll hear this in the sermon if you haven't already been there. I didn't know I was preaching till midnight last night. It's supposed to be Neil. So the middle third of my sermon, I preached before. John the Baptist. I'm ashamed. I said, Alan, have you never played the same music twice? Okay, never mind then. It was good 9 years ago, and it's going to be good today, and most of you won't remember it anyway. When I get to that's the John the Baptist part. John the Baptist, this is a little aside, is likened to an Elijah figure. What else, other than settling disputes, does Elijah do within Judaism?
He heralds the coming of the Messiah.
He heralds the coming of the Messiah. So why is John the Baptist? Oh, wow, it fits within that story. So the middle third is old, but the end, beginning and end are new. Jesus did that all the time. He told different versions of stories. He took some other story he heard, from his uncle and these guys down here, and one from his mom, and molded them to get people to pay attention. So always go back to thinking of Jesus first as a teacher and interpreter of what the Bible is and what it says.
I like that.
Okay.
Apropos Jonathan's comment just now that no one parable is the summation of or the totality of the theology or Christianity or Jesus' ministry or anything of the sort. I was just reading, it's now in paperback, a new biography about the mathematician Kurt Gödel. And it's now, I mentioned it's a paperback because it was in the Times this morning again. And at the end of the short review, it describes of this mathematician that this biography demonstrates that a life can't be proved. Remember, this is a mathematician dealing with mathematical proofs. That a life can't be proved, it can only be shown. And that's what this biography's accomplished, according to this reviewer. I thought that's very clever. It seems to me that comment, that a life can't be proved, it can only be shown, is not unlike what we're talking about when we talk about these parables. I'm officiating at a funeral later today, and when I speak with families about what we're doing in writing a eulogy, I often say we're trying to take the best parts of someone's personality and qualities of character that we want to lift up and remember this individual in these ways at their best. It's not a eulogy, a CV, or a resume, or a memoir, or an autobiography. It's not meant to capture everything. It's meant to give you a sense of who this person was as we want most to remember them. And it seems to me that the parables are opportunities also to be invited into a conversation about what the preacher, what the teacher, in this case what Jesus, is talking about. In Judaism, the idea of grappling with a text or wrestling is often the image, the verb that's described, taken from Jacob's wrestling match with the angel, at the end of which his name is changed from Jacob to Israel. And Israel, if you break down the word into its component roots and what have you, means essentially one who wrestles with or struggles with God. Not the one who bests God or the one who definitively can define or explain or understand God, but to wrestle with God. And if you read that story closely, you'll notice that at the end, Jacob is not only is his name changed, but he's granted a blessing. That is, they accorded the win, but he wrestles the angel to a draw, essentially. Right? They both agree, we're going to call a truce, no one won here, but for wrestling all the night through, or for not giving up with the struggle or grappling with this parable, which is what our teacher Amy Jill Levine suggests, that we not dispense with these parables by oversimplifying them, or being certain that we now understand them and we can put them away because we've decoded them, the tumblers have fallen into place, the lock has sprung open, and we can move on to the next mathematical problem on the quiz. But rather, these are ongoing things. Jonathan and I were talking earlier that when asked if these stories are true, they're true not because they happened, per se, but because they happen again and again and again. All right, I'll take a breath.
When Jesus is asked, this is summing up to a degree, when Jesus is asked, what's the most important thing? There are 613 commandments. That's a lot. If we could, distill it down, not 10 is probably too many. What are we really supposed to focus on? What does Jesus say? Love God with all your heart, soul, mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. Is that in the Hebrew Bible, Aaron?
It is.
Yes. So he's summarizing from his own tradition, what we call Judaism, and think of all the parables. So think of Jesus first as a rabbi, in addition to Messiah and all the rest. Think of all the parables as different ways of coming at that summary. So what does it mean to love God and love your neighbors yourself? Oh, I'll tell you a story about that. And it's one after the other of how you put that into practice. These are not just cool ideas or interesting theological problems to discuss. They're really meant to be practical stories that we take something from and begin to see how we would integrate that into our own lives. How would I treat people? How do I think about money? How do I think about time or God or Jesus or even myself? That's what these are doing. And today's is one more example of that.
I'm going to say one more. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
One more thought, because this is what I want to make sure I leave you with, and that is this idea that this daily wage is not the price of admission, but imagine that you got this daily wage, or you understood that you got this daily wage up front. That is to say, when you come onto the labor force, as it were, this daily wage is credited to your account. How you spend it, or how much time you have in which to spend it, or what's available to you to purchase, or how you make use of that in your coffers, that's up to you. And insofar as you don't know how much time, in fact, you'll be doing. How much time you'll be doing, right? How much time you'll serve here on earth. But insofar as you don't know that, perhaps the notion will be different, as opposed to working with the expectation that you're going to get what's been agreed to at the end. There's a Talmudic concept in reading the Bible that allows the rabbis in the Talmud to do what they do hermeneutically, which is to take a verse from here and a verse from here and suggest that they speak to each other. And the phrase is ein mukdam ve'ein muchar, which means there's no early and there's no late. That the temporality of stories or the timing of events, though they're laid out, Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and then Exodus 1, 2, and 3, would suggest that there's a chronology there in trying to make sense of it not as a story that's linear or that's historical, but is instead a theological blueprint. We can understand what's being described in a story such as this, using this Talmudic hermeneutic, to be that anything happened at any time in the story. And so what if, as you came onto the labor force, you were given the money, as opposed to at the end? What if we understood the daily wage to be that which we're granted when we're born, or conceived, or whenever you believe the story of you begins? What if that's when the gift is given, or that's when the wages are paid? And now you have the rest of your life to work with that, to live in that. Okay.
Okay. Thank you all.